the experience of constantly returning to God. Our Dinan. Every single day I need to return. Why? Returning to God is returning to myself. Today, for example, you lived a day in which you donated blood, right? Your time, your craft, what you learned. And it is also the place where you have to survive, to live with dignity. Today you gave yourself to many. Did you give yourself, or did you give your work at home and the routine of an extremely exhausting domestic life? Women who live this, men who live this. There's a lot of day to day. It's all very crazy, right? A lot. Doing the same things every single day isn't easy. Do you need to? Home, the monotony of a routine, and find a reason to keep doing it there. It's exhausting. You mentioned you've talked to a lot of people. You paid attention. You've answered a lot of messages. You've made contact with a lot of people. And now it's time to return to yourself. This should be every single day. After giving ourselves to others, is it time for you to be a partner? For you to be yours alone? Even if you sleep in the same bed with someone, you have to create a routine of returning to yourself is a return to yours. Because if not, we die before our time. Or else you start giving what you no longer have. That the wear and tear of it is precisely this. When you give a lot of yourself to others and don't take it back. And rebuild so that the next day you have the energy, the strength to continue offering yourself to others. It's interesting because when you return to yourself, are you returning to the God who lives in you? And then you will do the examination of conscience, as we talked about in this week's program. Past, will you come in? In communion, I can hear if. It's very important. Unfortunately, we don't have much of this, huh? We live a lot. In a great hurry. What happened? And we go to bed with the same rush, with the same anxiety we lived all day. This one doesn't take his face off the cell phone. And we are constantly stimulated by it, right? Create the routine of returning to yourself. You know how someone who's been making a path back and reorganizing where they've been? This is fundamental in the inner life. In fact, that's what inner life is. Is it you? Living in constant processes of self-restitution. The wear and tear of everyday life. Will you recover from it? Sometimes, even at your bath time. When will you take your bath? You won't have contact with another person. You won't be answering or receiving calls. You won't be sending messages, and then at that moment you will recover. Will you return to yourself? Listen, do you know why, my people? If we unlearn how to serve, you will lose the references of what do you want? Why can't you? What don't you want? What can't you? And how did you see where you can't if you don't listen to yourself? And here comes a characteristic of postmodernity, right? We are throwing on to others the responsibility of telling us who we are. There are people who go to therapy with this anxiety. The therapist, he will help me. But I am the one who needs to tell myself who I am. The therapist will not give me a ready answer. I need to know who I am. I need throwing on to others the responsibility of telling us who we are. Some people go to therapy with this anxiety. Well, the therapist will help me. But am I the one who needs to tell myself who I am? The therapist won't give me a ready-made answer. I need to know who I am. I need to know what I want, how I want it, with whom I want it. If I don't have a habit of watching my videos, I can't afford not to pay attention. And if I don't have a habit of paying attention to myself, how will I know this by receiving the message from others? Or finding out the hard way when we become emotionally ill, or even physically ill as a consequence of a dissatisfaction we've been living with for many years? Father, a profession can hinder spiritual strengthening and my relationship with God. I'm a lawyer. What can it do? What we choose to do can, and often does, determine the quality of our spiritual life. If you have a job that's too exhausting, that drains your emotions. You'll have a lot of difficulty with your spiritual life because it's closely linked to the health of our emotions. I remember that in the past, we talked about the great conflicts, for example, that law brings to those who practice it. The criminal lawyer, for example, the law establishes, and it's correct, that even a murderer needs to be defended. He can hire a lawyer who will try to minimize the consequences of the crime he committed. Imagine the world of a criminal lawyer. It's an extremely difficult world. He'll deal with extremely difficult heavy situations. Will the life of a criminal lawyer? Will it be characterized by constant clashes and battles? Less about how this will impact his life. How will he choose? In what way? For example, if I were a criminal lawyer, I would have a lot of difficulty because just one report of crime makes me feel bad. So much so that this is why we need a lot of clarity, a lot of clarification with the profession we choose to practice. I have a sensitive soul who suffers greatly with the suffering of others. How am I going to be able to enter this world of criminal law? So, of course, when you're in the field you've chosen, you'll face the challenges inherent to your profession. A doctor, for example, will also have a tiring routine. But think about it. In medicine, I can interpret my profession as an opportunity to bring health to people, and that's a hook for my spirituality. I don't know what the real hook would be in law. I've never thought about it. What does a lawyer who deals with disputes do? They can constantly search. A hook to nourish their spirituality. In fact, would it be worthwhile for us to even have the testimony of a lawyer who, in their daily life, manages to practice law and have a healthy spiritual life? Of course it's possible. I'm giving an example of a situation I'm unfamiliar with. I'm saying that if I were a criminal lawyer, I would have a lot of difficulty. But maybe whoever is, they've already built up an immunity to deal with all that confusion to get home. Cultivating your spirituality, or even in the practice of law, finding a way to put your heart and spirituality there. The fact, folks, is that every profession we pursue in life needs to be in harmony with our soul. This is fundamental to any profession we pursue, whatever we choose to pursue. Spiritual life is fundamental for us to perform our duties well. So, to you, Jesse, right? I think Jesse. Yeah, you'll discover how being a lawyer, dealing with so many disputes, you'll build your spiritual life is your challenge. The doctor's challenge will be another. The physical therapist's challenge will be another. The nutritionist's challenge will be, and the priest's challenge, because the priest's main objective is also to stimulate people's spiritual life. That's why I need it. For the sake of honesty, with the profession I chose to live in constant search for what is truly spiritual, I need to minimize as much as possible the influences of what we call the world on me. In Guatsu, they gave me that expression, right? Because it gives the impression that the world is a bad place, right? But we understand we speak. Sao Paulo makes this distinction very clearly. The fruits of the Spirit and the fruits of the flesh. A priest, for example, needs to constantly seek to cultivate the fruits of the Spirit, because otherwise I won't be able to lead others. Here, Horacio asked me a very interesting question about spiritual direction. He said, "Father, what isn't spiritual direction in a relationship between mentor and directee?" Look, spiritual life, Horacio, encompasses everything. So, what about your emotional health? A lack of conversation in your spiritual direction. Everything you experience emotionally, you'll take to your spiritual director. And sometimes I say, my people, this seems very distant from most people. Why are priests so busy with their countless pastoral activities that they hardly have time to provide spiritual direction for their flock? Sometimes the most we can do is hear confessions, not spiritual direction. That's what we're doing here. Father Joazinho brilliantly thought of this. When he wanted the program Spiritual Direction, he wanted precisely a space, meeting between the priest and the Catholic Christian, or anyone who is Christian and identifies with what we say, because you often don't have a direction. There's often no spiritual direction in your parish, but you end up using the spiritual direction program for yourself. Through reflection from someone who sent a question, or the topic I'm addressing here, you can walk the inner paths of reflection and improve the quality of your spirituality. What isn't spiritual direction is anything that doesn't help you evolve. Not that. In conversation with your spiritual director, they start proposing things that go against common sense or that you already recognize as not divine inspiration. At that point, it ceases to be spiritual direction. But every time you realize that what's being said is helping you rethink your life, improve the quality of your emotional life, rethink your approach to work, or even the choices you've made, you're in a state of spiritual direction. Where is spiritual direction most common? People who are consecrated. As a seminarian, I needed a spiritual director. Consecrated lay people usually have a spiritual director, a sister, a nun, a consecrated woman. And it's not always possible to find someone among the people who speaks, "I do spiritual direction." It's sorely missed. That's why the program can be a kind of help. It doesn't replace that conversation you might have regularly. Compadre, with the pastor, "I don't know where you worship. What is your Christianity?" If you are a Catholic Christian, if you are an Orthodox Christian, if you are an evangelical, the fact is that spiritual direction is fundamental to the education of the Christian conscience. We've been talking about this all month. We've been talking here throughout the month that our spirit needs to be educated. This is a fruit of spiritual direction. It's when you begin to realize that you are learning to make the inner path, which I sometimes say again. This is a keynote that I say whenever I can. Sometimes I am very religious. That is, I attended Mass, participated in worship. I participate in the prayer group. I participate in 1/3 of the men. I go to church regularly. But I am not a spiritual person. It happens. Religious life does not always transform into spiritual life. What? When do I know it is spiritual life? When my participation in the church, when my religious participation is making me walk the inner paths, which are the most difficult to travel. That's when I go inside myself. I listen to myself. I perceive myself. Consequently, I ask important questions here during the break. I was talking to my producer, Bia, who is a dear friend. She said that Father Jonas, he said, when someone was in crisis, he saw the positive aspect of the crisis and said, "I thank God for crisis." A crisis is an opportunity we have to become unstuck, as people say, right? Sometimes even very fickle. Thinking outside the box, You have the opportunity to look at yourself with a fruitfulness that we don't have the habit of looking at ourselves on a daily basis. You listen to what you have to say to yourself. What happens when you listen to yourself? When you pay attention to the voice of your conscience, which tells you what is right and what is wrong, you are hearing the voice of God. It's just that sometimes naively, we have the illusion of thinking that God will speak to us with a voice of thunder. My son, no, God speaks to you through your conscience. And many times he will speak to you through my reflection, but that will awaken your conscience. Notice, I'm not the one doing this to you. I'm not the one awakening you. In your understanding, I'm just being an instrument to awaken the inner voice that will tell you what is right and what is wrong. What should you do? What should you not do? Where should you insist? Where should you not insist? The word that comes from outside will provoke an inner movement. So I'm not responsible for your reflection. I just started it, and then you continued. A true spiritual director doesn't give ready-made answers. Just as a good therapist doesn't give ready-made answers, because truth is construction. When I ask myself if I'm okay, what do you hear all the time? Are you okay? And you? Do you ask yourself that? You look in a mirror and honestly ask, are you okay? It's not or. Who should ask us that? And sometimes the other person asks us, and we don't know what to say. Why aren't we in the habit of asking ourselves that question? I'm going. So are you okay? Have you heard enough to answer this properly? Isn't it time to start doing it, shall we?